freedom of the press is only guaranteed when you own the press.
Communication breakdown. Pause for the message, wake up. Every station is a gentrification. Global syndication is the shaping of the nation. ABC, Disney, NBC, GE, Murdoch is Foxy, and with a hen, he owns a pen, the camera, the sword, by a Coke, by a Ford, getting broke, getting bored.
And experience your psychic.
From the earliest days, freedom of the press was what defined America. Thomas Jefferson, who helped write the Declaration of Independence, believed a free media was essential for a free nation, saying, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. That was in 1787. Today, our newspapers seem to be fading in importance in a multimedia world that is largely owned and controlled by a handful of large media corporations.
I think we're probably the most media-dominated society in the world.
Jeff Cohn worked in major media. Now he's one of the industry's fiercest critics.
Half a dozen corporations own and control most of the mainstream media in our country. So if you're looking at who rules America or who owns America, it's the same people that propagandize to America.
The press and the outlets that report news or convey information are just a small slice of vast media empires producing entertainment products that also sell a way of life based on consumption.
When you look at who's on the boards of media corporations, they're also on the boards of U.S. oil companies, and they're on the boards of U.S. military contractors. So trying to study who owns America, you're really also, these are the people that own the media. We don't have a state media, but in some ways it's very much like a state media. It's the corporate state.
If this is true, then we can say that the American media doesn't just report news. As we'll see, it's not independent of the system, but a pillar of it. It reinforces the worldview and defends the interests of those who rule America. "30 years ago, 50 companies dominated American media. Now it's down to 6. Here are some charts on media ownership that illustrate this concentration. With new global digital enterprises like Google, Facebook, and Twitter growing in importance worldwide, U.S.-based media became a transnational force. The U.S. media companies are themselves owned in large part by hedge funds, mutual funds, and finance companies. Barry James Dyke is an asset manager who has studied media ownership.
The research which I've done is unequivocal, and I kind of stumbled into this, is that the media companies, the major media companies, i.e. the Disneys, the CBSs, the news corporations, all of them, this is all public documents, is that they're all actually owned by mutual fund companies. The majority shareholders are owned by mutual fund companies. So, and also, they also get a lot of their revenue from these companies. So you're never going to see any consistent criticism about these fund companies.
Are these companies investigated by the media?
No, they're not.
Are they responsible to the public in some way? Are they accountable? Do the public really know what they're doing?
The public really doesn't have a clue. They really don't know what they're doing.
He has documented his findings with charts in his own book, The Pirates of Manhattan.
Well, people are not going to be not getting the truth.
But there is a lot of coverage, especially of politics, that's often treated as a sporting event, with an emphasis on poll numbers and election results. Mary Boyle follows media coverage of elections for Common Cause. What about the role of the media? Is the media helping to strengthen our democracy, or do you think it's helping to divide us?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that, there are a couple of things going on there. Obviously, you've got kind of cable channels that are you know, in different camps, and they are not showing different points of view. You've got Fox News showing the right, you've got MSNBC showing the left. And so with a setup like that, you have Americans that are just kind of tuning in to the channel they want to listen to, that, you know, kind of expresses their views, and you're not seeing kind of a mix of an opinion, a debate, anything like that. You've also got, you know, the shrinkage of the media. You've got less coverage of what's going on. And I think this is particularly concerning more around kind of state-based and local politics, where there's even less coverage of what's going on in politics.
But even as the world is known for its diversity, American media is not. Editorially and ideologically, the power elite tends to reflect the views of the government and the people who shape its views. Dissenting politicians like Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. have a hard time getting their views heard.
Who owns the media? How the media is translated? Some of the moguls and the titans of media and industry are part of the problem. They shape a narrative for the American people, a narrative that ultimately leads millions of people to vote for candidates based upon the narrative that they shape, based upon the talking heads that they control. And those Americans tend to vote and tend to engage the system on the basis of that which they hear. Media is a significant part of this problem.
Historian Eric Foner agrees. He says it's not just political bias at work, but what the media as a business feels it's forced to focus on to attract ratings and revenues. Somehow, that idea of power behind the people in office is not really in our media very much. It's not really in people's minds very much. They personalize politics. There are personalities combating each other, but they don't look at who's behind the scenes.
Well, you're quite right that the media focuses on personalities, you know, and often the quirks of personality, Clinton's sexual escapades, or whether Obama was born in the United States or not, or Romney and his cars and whatever, you know, his not paying taxes and many other things. Those are not totally unimportant issues, but maybe it's the nature of the media today in and of itself, in that it has to go for the quick news. Deep investigative reporting is not emphasized as much as perhaps it was in the past. And, you got to sell papers, and scandal sells papers, personality sells papers, celebrity sells papers. So you're right, that the larger nature of how the system operates tends not to get emphasized as much.
It's not even understood by many people.
Well, it's hard to understand. This is a very large country, over 300 million people, a very, very complicated economy and political system, so it's difficult to understand exactly how things operate. But I think, in a certain sense, the anti-government sentiment, which is rife in this country, which is generally associated with the right wing, is also a response to the feeling. It's an inchoate feeling. It's not an analytical feeling, but it's a feeling that government is aloof. It is not responsive. It does not really represent the people. It represents some very particular interests, and that sense is pretty widespread in this country.
Media watch groups are also concerned about the lack of diversity within the media that makes it unrepresentative of the country it serves in racial, ethnic, and gender terms.
The unwritten credo of the New York Times is do not alienate those for whom we depend on for money and access.
Chris Hedges was an award-winning journalist for the New York Times, an American media star.
And that means the power elite and the financiers who advertise. But it's expandable. I mean, you have, at least in the positions that I was in, the possibility to do journalism. Not that there aren't, restrictions or constrictions. There are, and not that they can't be punishing.
Hedges' work is still very respected, but he believes that much of the press is ultimately a charade that covers up for power more than covers it, especially when reporting on elections.
Because the political theater, I mean, the personal narrative of the candidate, it's all irrelevant. It's meaningless, and people, we still play the game. Look, every totalitarian country I covered had elections. They all play the charade. I mean, even East Germany did, and that's the charade we play. And when we have a compliant corporate media that pretends that charade is real, so I think. The problem is that the illusion still remains so powerful. But people are changing, but the illusion is still so powerful that people confuse where power actually exists.
How does the New York Times cover the power centers that many people say rule America? Chris Spanos edits the New York Times Examiner that monitors the newspaper's content every day. He believes the paper has become an accomplice to the power elite.
The New York Times as an institution is almost like a mini nation. And the correspondents, the op-ed writers, the editors, they're almost like diplomats in how they carry themselves and their own self-importance in the way that they communicate with other politicians and diplomats. And they are very influential.
Would you say that they're a disseminator of ideology in America, not just of information?
Absolutely. They disseminate a very particular ideology in that their readership is primarily managers and people who make around over $90,000 a year, and so they cater to a managerial perspective, and so they have a pro-management when they're discussing labor relations. They often have a pro-management view, a pro-business view.
Financial journalists like Stacy Herbert and Max Kaiser found that many pro-business views in some media outlets were often uninformed, as they told me on a radio show.
From December 2008, so well after the collapse of Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, the market's tumbling 1,000 points in a day, and the head of BBC World News Business said, and we had a 10-episode contract, do you think the financial crisis will last all the way through these 10 episodes?
So in other words, the people actually in charge of planning the coverage are very uninformed themselves.
Well, the mainstream media are themselves deeply in debt. You know, the news organizations have become entertainified, and to compete, they take on enormous amounts of debt. So the bankers, they don't want to insult their creditors because they might cut off their lines of credit. So they're not unbiased in this regard in any stretch of the imagination. You see this most spectacularly with the New York Times. Their coverage of the Wall Street is pitiful.
To my world.
One reason the press is so pro-business is that they are themselves businesses. The people who run media companies increasingly pay themselves huge salaries and bonuses the same way that bankers do, says Barry Dyke.
Yeah, Les Moonves, I couldn't believe he made $59 million in 2009, and he racked up, it was just disclosed the other day that he made close to $70 million in 2010.
And that's the head of CBS.
That's the head of CBS.
But you're saying that all of them are really running their businesses as if they were banks.
I mean, that's pretty good. That's banker pay. I mean, $70 million is a lot of money in anyone's book, and that's what they're getting paid.
So the media companies are really part of this whole system of who rules America. They're part of these interconnecting, interlocking relationships with financial institutions.
There's no question about it. You get the media companies, which are huge. It's part of the empire. You get the media companies, you get the bankers, of course. You have your massive, unions. Okay, you have other factors as well. But the media is definitely part of it, and the asset managers.
That's exactly it. The corporations that own the U.S. media and own U.S. television are very wealthy and very powerful. And the people at the top of the news networks get paid an awful lot of money. I have never earned anything close to the amount of money I earned in the 1 year I worked where General Electric was my boss at MSNBC. So what I think happens is a self-censorship where the people who rise to the top have learned how not to rock any boats, and they know if they do rock boats, they will lose their huge salaries.
Newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal tend to frame a deeper narrative that tells us what we should believe matters. They set the agenda that influences what TV news programs also cover. For example, they don't focus on inequality and class differences, says independent media executive Brian Drolet.
They don't talk about the working class, and part of it is it's like the idea that, you know, they promote this idea that, you know, if you buy a lottery ticket you could win, right? So you're already thinking that maybe you could win. So if you're in the working class, or you're part of the working class that's unemployed, you still have this hope that somehow you're going to go into the middle class.
There's been very little attention paid to class. I mean, you were saying that the media really doesn't discuss this. They don't really highlight class differences in America. They're much more comfortable talking about racial differences or ethnic differences. At the same time, in their business practices, they're very conscious of demographics. What class are they attracting? Upper class, how to cater their advertising, how to sell it.
No, they go, I mean, you know, the internet is a perfect example of that. Google and everything, where they're constantly slicing and dicing who you are, so they know exactly how much you make, so they can pitch what kind of products to you. But that's this whole sort of madness of the consumer society that's been created by modern capitalism. But the key thing I think that you're getting at is that even though there is a reality of class, a working class in this country, and a ruling class or a bourgeois class, people have been trained not to think in those terms, so they don't even know who they are.
Some networks, like Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch, seem to be more comfortable presenting a right-wing political line. They have helped shift many media outlets to the right.
There is a school of thought that says we should have given the citizens of Baghdad 48 hours to get out of Dodge and flatten the place. Then the war would be already over, and we could have done that in 2 days.
That may be so, but old media is being eclipsed by the new, says George Scribner, the vice president of Digitas, a company that comes up with digital strategies for big companies and studies how affluent consumers now drive marketing in an era of growing economic inequality.
The one thing that's different now is that the media is owned by everyone. You know, the thing that's kind of leveling off the dollars to some extent is that everyone has access to Twitter, everyone has access to blogging, and there's this new kind of fast and fluid coalition building. Like Occupy Wall Street was one example of that. The Arab Spring was an example of that. So in some ways, kind of there's a new check and balance. I don't think that's necessarily changing the restructuring of income and wealth, but I do think there's another trip switch that might help us when things get too bad.
So the digital media, in a
Yes.
way, is where democracy
Exactly.
is today. It's not in politics,
Yes.
it's not in big business, it's not in big money.
That's true. I think that's well said.
There is some debate on how free the internet really is, given corporate control and government censorship, but it does make possible more interactivity. At the same time, media attention still tends to revolve around a political elite with authority, even if that elite doesn't necessarily have the power to shape priorities or impose policies. But when you talk to ordinary Americans, many of them feel it's totally fair.
Yeah.
They're seeing different points of view. They're seeing people who are critical from time to time. They see the media as the liberal media in some instances.
I was in the Soviet Union, and we were always raised in this country that's pure propaganda. And frankly, it was very ineffective propaganda because they never pretended to have two points of view. They would have one point of view saying how great things are. But in our country, propaganda is really effective because they have the appearance of debates.
The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world.
Jeff Cohn says that just as Americans were misled about Iraq before the war, they are being misled today about Iran. He pointed to a study about Iraq before the American invasion that found that of some 393 people who were interviewed on all the networks, only 3 were anti-war.
Because almost everything we knew about Iraq before the invasion turned out to be false. And almost everything we're learning today about Iran is not accurate. And we went to the New York Times a couple months ago where they said that the International Atomic Energy Association has put out an assessment that the nuclear program in Iran has a military objective. And FAIR, this media criticism group, went to the Times and said, which report is that? We've never heard of it. The Times knew they'd made a big error. It was a prominent error. They removed the sentence from their website, but they refused to correct the error.
It's not just wars that get propagandized. Media does not often cover the people behind the scenes who run things, says William Hartung, who has written about the military-industrial complex.
You would think there would be some independence in the journalism on this issue. But in some cases, reporters have even said to me, well, I can't go after the Pentagon harder or the companies harder or this nexus of influence harder because this company is a big advertiser in the paper. And we'll get pressure, if we do those kinds of stories. So we'll do stories about the war in Afghanistan. We'll repeat what the president has to say on an issue. But there's not really a lot of interest or resources put into investigating these kinds of connections.
David Swanson, who also writes about military policy, agrees.
Well, the corporate media in the United States is integrated with the military-industrial complex. Some of the same corporations are making profits from both. There are two major political parties that don't have much disagreement on this topic, so it's not a topic for debate. No matter if 90% of the public is upset about it, it's not acceptable news.
Michael Clare, who's investigated the destructive power of oil and gas companies, says the same is true when it comes to that industry.
The media doesn't cover this for the most part. In fact, the media is largely in league because of the advertising dollars that the oil and gas lobby provides. They're very heavily dependent on advertising revenue, so they're very careful in what they say.
Big business, a wealthy and frequent advertiser in the media, is often not scrutinized by the media. That was the case in the financial crisis, says Sheila Krumholz of the Center for Responsive Politics.
So these are complicated issues. The issues are difficult to understand on a good day, and they seem, again, very arcane and unimportant to the average American. So it's possible that some media were laboring away trying to explain why this was critical information that the voters need. I think a lot of blame, though, can be laid at the feet of the media for the financial collapse. Ultimately, what we do know is that it's critical. If there's any perfect scenario that shows why transparency and paying attention and scrutinizing the powerful players and what they want and what they're doing to get their way, the financial crisis is that perfect example. It shows us how important transparency is.
Because significant wealth demands significant attention. Together we can give you and your wealth the wings to soar. Goldman Sachs Wealth Management.
At the same time, media has become so pervasive online and off, on TV and on our mobile phones, that many Americans say they are becoming victims of information overload. The more they watch, the less they know.
For sure, information overload is, I think, a serious threat to democracy, because it doesn't work if people aren't vigilant. Nobody's going to hold members of Congress accountable for you. You have to you have to make sure that you're heard. I think there's also the sense that because there is this tension, and some would say healthy tension, between concern about protecting the process, democracy, and government from money's undue influence versus protecting freedom of speech and privacy. Nobody wants to censor information. We want our representatives to have all the information, even if it's coming from deep-pocketed corporations, unions, or trade associations, very narrow interests. We just want to make sure that they are doing their job to seek alternative perspectives, even if they're coming from groups that have no power and have no money.
Media criticism tends to revolve around what's being covered and not covered, and not on the way media narratives shape how we think and what we think about. That's the power of media, and why it is now among the forces ruling America.
Chicago!
Every school child learns power in Washington is formally divided three ways between the executive branch in the White House, now occupied by Barack Obama, in the judicial branch topped by the Supreme Court with 9 judges, all political appointees, and the legislative branch where the Senate has 100 members with 2 from every state, and the House of Representatives 435 drawn from districts across America. This is the formal system of checks and balances that is supposed to keep the country on the stable course of democracy. And yet, wherever you go in this capital of America and meet the people who are the most informed about how the government really works, you hear that the system isn't working and that the voters are not in charge. You hear it from a member of Congress.
Who controls America? An elite group of people who function in a stratosphere globally and beyond the Constitution, beyond the reach of government. They have enormous resources.
You hear it from an expert on our elections.
Our politics are being hijacked. They're being hijacked by people who are willing to spend millions of dollars to, elect or defeat certain candidates.
You hear it from the head of a public interest group.
We have a plutocracy. We have a corporate plutocracy, and the rules in Washington are written by the corporate lobbyists working on behalf of the biggest corporate interests in the country.
And you hear about lobbyists from a veteran former congressional staffer who would only talk to us if his face and voice were altered.
99% of the people that I see lobbying Congress are white men and women who you can tell wear very nice, expensive suit and ties and dresses, and they are going into the Republican offices. I rarely see African Americans here. I rarely see Hispanics. I rarely see Asians. I rarely see Muslims. It's like you see these very well-dressed guys who just came off Learjets, and you can tell they're right out of the country club. And they're going to the Republican offices asking for a tax cut of some kind.
These are not just opinions. This well-researched book by William Domhoff details how the government today is being run by powerful elite forces outside the government. As we will see, his conclusions are supported by experienced insiders here in Washington, D.C. All of these insiders say that money and special interests are now in control. They too ask, who rules America? In Washington, we spoke with leaders of 3 respected watchdog organizations that specialize in researching and analyzing hidden forces operating behind the scenes. Public Citizen focuses on corruption and accountability issues. Robert Weissman is their president and described how laws get passed.
How does a piece of legislation emerge? How does it become law? How does it get implemented, and how does it get enforced? At every step of the way, you really have sort of corporations in whatever industry dominating the process.
Why don't congressmen, the people we elect, challenge this system?
Well, they are products of the system. And so they've got an inherent bias of favoring it. Look, they've succeeded in the system one way or another. And those who challenge it are going to have to fight really entrenched power. So there, of course, there are many of them who are very good and who do challenge the system. But by and large, people got to Washington because they figured out how to make the system work for them. Even if they came in as insiders, most of them were quickly educated on the ways that things really do work in Washington if they hope to get things done or get reelected. And they succumb to the corporate interests.
Where does the money come from? The top 100 donors have given 77% of the money going to super PACs. That means 1% of the donors are giving 64% of the money. This is a tiny elite that can afford to make the contributions that are going to be most influential in this election cycle.
This website, opensecrets.org, documents where all the money in politics originate. Sheila Krumholz oversees it as the executive director of the Center for Responsive Politics.
Well, I think many of the people who are concerned about money's role in Washington and how it greases the skids for private, narrow interests to kind of rule the day believe that the money is, that members of Congress and policymakers control the levers of power, but that the donors, the kind of patrons of these people, are operating the strings. The politicians are kind of the visible locus of power, but the people behind them really are calling the shots.
How do we find out who those people are?
Well, we have millions upon millions of records of donations to federal candidates, political action committees, including leadership PACs, which are their kind of slush funds that they control, and the parties. We also can see money going directly to the super PACs. These are the political action committees, which are supposedly or are only giving contributions to groups that are spending money to run independent expenditures, independent of the campaigns and parties. The problem is, of course, that there's this secret pot of cash being collected by groups that do not disclose where the money's coming from, and they are running advertising, political ads, which are often quite damning and nasty and not sometimes irresponsible, but are highly influential, and we have no idea where their money is coming from.
She showed us what their data shows, a small minority controlling the process with very few millionaires funding all politics.
There are 610 registered super PACs, 95 of them are ponying up the money for the ads so far. But this chart really demonstrates what a dramatic increase we've seen in spending on advertising by these groups. So in 2012, we're seeing over 100 million spent. That's a 100% increase over the amount spent in 2008 and a 400% increase over last cycle.
This is a who's who of who's lobbying in Washington between 1998 and 2012. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce spent $831 million. The American Medical Association, $269 million. General Electric, $268 million. The Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America admit to $219 million plus for lobbying, and there are many, many more. 2012 could be a turning point in American politics because of all the big money that's literally being invested. Mary Boyle is the vice president of Common Cause.
In who is ruling America, you certainly have to look at the people who are giving the most money to political campaigns. They are highly influential. People who give a lot of money to political campaigns, millions of dollars, want something for return. They tend to be really savvy business people who have made a lot of money because, they know what they're doing, and they don't make investments without wanting an investment on their return.
It's unfortunate, but obviously it buys media time. It also buys constant mail efforts. And also, obviously, you support candidates who will ultimately come to the United States Congress who may vote your way.
The largest contributors to political campaigns in America are the financial institutions. The second largest contributors are large real estate developers. That means that if you're running for office, you have to get elected by promising to support policies that are supported by the real estate sector and by the financial sector that lends to the real estate sector.
And doesn't this really kind of put the democracy under threat?
Yeah, I mean, corporations are free now due to Citizens United and a couple of other court rulings to give more money than they have ever been allowed to be before. And that is certainly a threat to our democracy, because what it does is it drowns out the voices of regular people. It's,
discouraging in one sense, in that the election of 2008 showed a tremendous number of people who want change, and yet there seems to be at every turn change is being resisted by minorities that are very skillful at undermining change. Certainly 2008 was the, change election, and we have been disappointed there has not been more change coming from the White House. Now that President Obama is running for re-election, he too is spending most of his time raising money, $2 billion for political campaigns. That's why Robert Weissman says this scandal involves both parties.
Yeah, it's a bipartisan problem for sure. The $2 billion is just the presidential race. The overall national race will probably be around $8 billion. Obama is an extremely talented fundraiser, so he's going to be able to raise big money. The massive chunks of outside super rich money and corporate money, though, look like they're going to go overwhelmingly to the Republicans.
It is so expensive to run for office, whether it's a presidency or the state legislature, that you just have to go out and start raising money from people who want something in return to run for office.
The money in politics just doesn't finance candidates, it pays for lobbying. In 2011, there were 12,654 lobbyists spending $3.32 billion on influencing politicians, agencies, and regulators.
I was with a group of 20 women from the Middle East last week, and we said they wanted to know about Code Pink and our work, and I said, come to Congress and meet us. And we met in the cafeteria, and we looked all around and said, all these people are lobbying Congress, and they think they're going to have some influence. But the influence doesn't happen here. There's a special place in the Capitol that special people go to that we can't go to, and that's where the people who have money go to do the lobbying. And they also have their special parties where they pay a lot of money to have a face-to-face with their congressperson. That's where things get done.
The scholar Francis Fox Piven says that's because of another problem. Not all Americans can or do vote.
We have a very developed, very twisted, and very distorted system of electoral representation. It is distorted not only by big money, although that's certainly very, very important because of the advertising and the campaigning that it makes possible. A lot of people do not, in fact, have the franchise, and even those who vote are not represented fairly. People in smaller states have more representation, and so forth.
So this helps explain why small but well-funded groups like the pro-Israel lobby or pro-military lobby can have so much impact. Joanne Landy has examined who makes foreign policy.
It's an informal network of the people who rule America, even though they don't go around wearing signs saying we rule America. That's who makes the policy, whether it's with politicians or whether it's with think tanks or with the military or, they're all interconnected.
Landy says these lobbies are more united than divided.
There are disagreements among them, but they're disagreements about methods, not goals, So some people think you should get rid of some nuclear weapons, other people think you should hold on to them all. But the differences are really, they cover the gamut from A to B, as they used to say.
The sort of day-by-day run-of-the-mill reality is that those who have high positions in politics and strong connections with moneyed interests, and the moneyed interests themselves run the country.
We are now on the way to the Congress, which now enjoys less than a 10% approval rating from the public.
You know how you know a congressperson? Not only do they have a little pin here, but they never carry anything. It's always an assistant who's carrying something, and all they get is people who are fawning over them, and so they're in their bubble, and they don't recognize, I think, that the country is so cynical about them.
The congressmen are cynical, too. I literally ran into Representative John Conyers in a dark hallway. He's the longest-serving member. He complains that they are being deluged by lobbyists.
Are you seeing a lot of Wall Street people donating to Congress, trying to stop the reforms?
You don't see that, but it's going on. They haven't stopped.
The Congress wanted to reform the financial laws, and it seems like they're being stopped at the regulatory level by all these donations from members of Congress, from big banks and Wall Street.
Well, it'll show up. It shows up on the quarterlies, but I have no reason to believe that there's been any cessation of that or reduction. And so you get the same results, stagnation.
JP Morgan Chase has shocked the markets by revealing a trading loss of over $2 billion.
2 weeks later, it was reported that the huge bank JP Morgan Chase lost $2 billion gambling on exotic derivative products.
And what they called a synthetic credit portfolio.
If Jamie Dimon makes this mistake, because we know he's good, but what the hell's going on at Citigroup and at Bank of America?
Thanks to the mistakes by JP Morgan, which is the biggest U.S. bank in terms of assets, rippled through the financial world. For many, it brings back memories of 2008, when big banks' risky bets threatened to collapse the financial system.
It was later reported that the bank's lobbyists had fought against a new rule that, if passed, would have prevented this giant loss. The internet buzzed with the bad news.
Because this is the derivatives market, this is very important. Could pan out to be nothing. Largest U.S. bank, best buddies with the Fed, and of course this is a whole lot of debt.
But none of the commentary I saw discussed the lobbying by JP Morgan Chase.
You see banks time and time again getting into problems, slipping up, and you've got America's biggest bank, JP Morgan, doing exactly that. And frankly, the banks are their own worst enemy.
We know we were sloppy. We know we were stupid. We know there was bad judgment. We don't know if any of that's true yet. Now, of course, regulators should look at something like this. That's their job. So, we are totally open kimono with regulators, and they will come to their own conclusions. But we intend to fix it, learn from it, and be a better company when it's done.
One of the amazing lessons, I think, of everything that led up to the crash is they can't control themselves, even to the extent that they will destroy their own industry, even to the extent they will destroy their own companies. The short-term profit motive seeps in so many pores of individuals and divisions and offices and then whole companies. They will destroy themselves. So we definitely can't trust them to figure out how to control themselves.
Public Citizen later played a role outlawing insider trading by members of Congress on information they obtained in hearings and investigations. Public Citizen considered it corruption.
The notion that the powerful shouldn't get to create one set of rules for themselves and another set of rules for everybody else. And if we expect that to apply to our biggest corporations and to our most successful citizens, it certainly should apply to our elected officials, especially at a time when there's a deficit of trust between this city and the rest of the country.
Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., the son of the famous civil rights leader, has been representing Chicago's 2nd District for 17 years. He's consumed with investigating and explaining how the system was set up historically to serve states' rights and special interests.
I filed an amendment to the Constitution to guarantee us the right to a public education of equal high quality. Why? Because every American that's in a public school ought not be in states' rights slavery. In other words, the lesson of the African American overcoming the Constitution with respect to states' rights was not heeded through time by the American people, and it is the exact same system that they are stuck in today, and they just don't know it.
We asked him why Congress has become so dysfunctional.
I've never seen it more polarized. I've never seen it more divided along geographical lines, along factional lines, along economic, political lines. It's not what the democracy was conceived to be. It's not what it was supposed to evolve into. And unfortunately, the American people are the victims of this process.
How would you answer that question? Who rules America?
There are two types of material power in this country and in the world. One is political, and one is economic. We, the people, have the power politically to control and determine the economic system. And there is a constant struggle between people power and economic power. We, the people, control, through the political system, our economic destiny and the economic destiny of the nation. Increasingly, the heavy hand of the economic system is controlling the political system and manipulating the people. Who controls America? An elite group of people who function in a stratosphere globally and beyond the Constitution, beyond the reach of government. They have enormous resources. They own the media, the power to investigate. They get to shape the narrative of the stories. They get to model and position candidates for public office and shape an image in front of the American people, an image that oftentimes does not jive with reality, and yet the American people see this image of leadership and they vote for it, only to find out the human frailties and the shortcomings of the individual at a later date.
We met a former congressional staffer who worked on the Hill for a leading legislator for 12 years. He agreed to talk with us only if we blacked out his face and distorted his voice. He was scathing in his description of how decisions get made.
This is a great institution, but unfortunately you have an untold amount of members of Congress that spend 60% of their time raising money, and then because they got to run every 2 years, which makes no sense, they have to raise millions of dollars just to be competitive, to go on television, because the CBS, ABC, and NBC and CNN charge this outrageous amount of money to get TV commercials. It ought to be free or very low cost. So what happens is these members of Congress are relying on well-intentioned staffers. Many of them are just out of college. Many of them were interns, to make major decisions on foreign policy and domestic policy and health care and employment and jobs, and they're not really mature enough.
He also told us many of the staffers get bought off by special interests and big donors.
And a lot of these young people are just out of college, just out of graduate school. They have to pay back these enormous college loans and graduate school loans. They're paying unbelievable rent in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, oftentimes more than a third of their income. A lot of them are taking care of out-of-work family members. So there's a pressure for them, on them to go work for the moneyed interest on K Street. A lot of staffers, even progressive staffers, have left the Hill and worked for the large drug companies, worked for the oil companies.
Well, it's usually the biggest industry. It's usually the biggest companies in whatever industry you're looking at. If you're looking at overall national economic policy, Wall Street is the dominant influence. You don't know what's happening in the pharmaceutical industry, and they're the big pharma's calls the shots. As within the financial industry, which factions are most important? It's still really the biggest institutions that set the agenda.
There have been polls on where Americans think our money goes in our government, and just about nobody has a clue. People wildly overestimate how much goes to aid, and of course part of that is because we talk about weaponizing foreign nations as aid, and they wildly underestimate how much goes to the military.
And yet, says our whistleblowing former congressional aide, the real problem is not just corporate power.
The biggest problem in America is not the corporations. It's not even necessarily the money for campaigns. The biggest problem is that the American people don't really organize themselves in their congressional districts to mitigate the power of special interests. They're not utilizing their democracy because they don't know how the game works. The donors know exactly how the game works. You give a member of Congress the money, they're going to probably do what they've asked them to do. So if you've got millions and millions of people who voted for Obama or vote for their member of Congress, and then that's the end of their political involvement, well, that's the end of democracy.
No series about who rules America can leave out Wall Street's financial clout. We've left its impact for last, secure in the knowledge that in today's America, this financial district is a key power center, a hub for the financialization of an economy in which the control of big money is often central to the control of politics and society. We have spoken with a respected corporate executive who told us point blank that the rich now rule America.
My personal opinion is a large part of what's happening economically is due to basically globalization and digitization of business. That can't be stopped.
Professor Stanley Aronowitz quotes the famous sociologist C. Wright Mills on the same theme from 50 years ago.
Wall Street, the financial sector,
is the leading edge of corporate capital. And it was the leading edge of corporate capital in the mid-50s. Of course, today it's much more accentuated because of the relative decline of industrial corporations.
I've heard things that'll blow your mind, and now I think it's time you get the whole story.
Many Americans see all this as a conspiracy by an unaccountable secret cabal that operates like a power center beyond democratic control. The internet is filled with videos about shadowy billionaires and their plots to control everything.
Which is ongoing right now. It is a conspiracy of institutional corruption from the highest level.
From international bankers to the super rich, from Washington to Rome, they're all in it together. And when
Is Wall Street a conspiracy? And what role does it play in who rules America? Is it an outside job or an inside job?
It's not a matter of elites outside the state, although of course they have enormous influence, but the reason they have enormous influence is because the state is structured to be reproducing their power and authority in the society.
Leo Panitch, he's an economist and analyst, and I think he offered a perspective that we really haven't heard before. He's sort of fighting against the conspiratorial idea, that there's a small group of people in a room somewhere running things. He's talking about the structure of the society, the values of it, who really runs things.
Wall Street is not only a place, it's an industry with thousands of interconnected firms that call themselves a financial services industry. But they are much more than that. They are deeply involved with how our country is run, says Robert Weissman, the head of the public interest group, Public Citizen.
Well, you can't understand what's happened in the country in the last 30 years in terms of economic policy and really the way the country's evolved politically without understanding how Wall Street has grown in power. It's grown in economic power and it's grown in political power, and that's been synergistic. They use their political power to wipe out a whole range of regulations that control them.
In the past, investors would buy stocks in real companies and industries that generated jobs, provided services, or created products of value. Those days are gone.
They became a bigger and bigger portion of the economy.
Then we went from an economy of production, making things, to one based on consumption, buying and selling things. Consumers soon drove 70% of the economy as banks, private equity companies, and hedge funds grew in size.
As they became a bigger portion of the economy, they were able to leverage more and more political power in a really horrible cycle for the functioning of democracy. And what that led us up to, of course, was the crash in 2008.
So consumers went deeper and deeper into debt. And then bankers bought and sold debt while they changed the rules regulating their activities.
A whole series of deregulatory moves that had been enabled by the political influence of Wall Street led to the actual functioning of the economy to be a disaster.
Because as billionaire investor George Soros told me years ago, the capitalist economy is also inherently unstable and prone to bubbles and crashes.
I've worked with the theory that financial markets are inherently unstable. And to prevent excesses, you need some kind of intervention, supervision, regulation. Unfortunately, the prevailing idea is that markets tend towards equilibrium. And so we work with a false concept of how financial markets operate.
Well, we were told by someone, for example, that the beauty of globalization is that no one is in control.
Well, there is a great advantage in that because controls have their own problems. In fact, markets are much more efficient than centralized controls. But it doesn't mean that there should be absolutely no control. And in fact, if you look at reality, ever since you've had capitalism and ever since you have had financial markets, you have had crises. And each time there was a crisis, there was something done to prevent a recurrence.
The problem this time is the dramatic surge in debt. Look at this. These are charts showing the debt of the United States, page after page, illustrating how much money is owed. It's mind-boggling. It gets even more complicated when you start talking about new financial instruments like derivatives that have turned the industry into a global casino. Derivatives can also be used as insurance, betting that a loan will or won't default before a given date. They become the basis of a big betting system, like in a casino. Financial journalist Max Kaiser says just a handful of big financial firms now dominate the industry and the global economy.
Without a doubt, there's JP Morgan, which is in bed with the Fed into the central banking system.
Wall Street bets on future values and the performance of practically everything of value.
So you've got Morgan, Goldman Sachs are the two primary players in this global financialized world.
Soon, CEOs, financiers, and executives of a small number of investment banks and hedge funds became rich and powerful by controlling specialized high-stakes markets.
They are connected to the central banking system, which is the Fed, the ECB. The Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland is kind of the central bank of the central banks. These are the folks that are keeping, their main purpose at this point is to keep interest rates as close to zero as possible, to make it as cheap as possible for people who are borrowing money to speculate, to be able to speculate freely without having to pay for the money that they're borrowing to speculate.
Even if these financial markets are supposedly open to all, a relatively few traders, investors, and asset managers came to structure the markets to increase their own wealth and power.
And if they ever make a bad bet, then they quickly move to cover their bad bets with austerity programs or some kind of bailout program or a quantitative easing program.
A Swiss study by physicists on the ownership and control of stock exchanges in 48 countries examined 24,877 stocks and 106,141 shareholding entities. To their amazement, they found that just 10 companies were dominating all stock ownership. Here they are. When we talk about money and we talk about Wall Street, we have to ask this question: where does the money come from that's used in the speculation in our financial markets? This man knows, Barry James Dyke. He's an asset manager and he works with clients. So where does it come from?
The money comes from people's savings, regular old savings, people's retirement funds, which is saving for retirement.
But do the people who put their money into these accounts know how it's being invested or spent?
They don't have a clue.
It's only now, as a result of the financial crisis, that the public is learning slowly that the self-styled masters of the universe on Wall Street speculated on risky investments and created a crash. Graydon Carter, the editor of Vanity Fair, wrote, "It can fairly be said that the chain of catastrophic bets made over the past decade by a few hundred bankers may well turn out to be the greatest nonviolent crime against humanity in history. They brought the world's economy to its knees, lost tens of millions of people their jobs and their homes, and crashed the retirement plans of a generation. And they could drive an estimated 200 million people worldwide into dire poverty." In 2010, before Occupy Wall Street, labor unions were marching to protest Wall Street crimes.
On the 29th of April, this is a march on Wall Street organized by the AFL-CIO, which says they've organized 200 protests so far, but you never know it in terms of the media coverage. Well, today, the media is out, and they're marching because of a theft. Millions of jobs are missing, 11 million jobs, according to the AFL-CIO. They want payback. They want Wall Street to pay. They want a new tax on financial transactions. We are trying to recover from a financial crisis that some people say is even worse than the Depression in the 1930s. And yet, reforms that have been proposed, very modest reforms, are being fought tooth and nail at the regulatory level by Wall Street firms and financiers. Do you think that they have a disproportionate power to influence Congress?
There's no doubt about that. Not just the Congress, but state legislatures as well. Their strength, their power runs the entire gambit of the American political system.
I read that the financial services industry had hired 28 lobbyists per member of Congress to try to influence their decisions, to try to inform. What happens to you when lobbyists come into your office to try to get you to vote their way? How does that work, that game?
Well, it's very hard to get a meeting with me. I don't think that they spent a lot of money trying to lobby me. I'm kind of clear on my ideology, clear on my view of representative government, and very clear on the Constitution. But suffice it to say, while my district is competitive, there are many more competitive districts than mine. And every member of Congress, to that extent, becomes a prisoner to the election process, to the fundraising process.
Sheila Krumholz of the Center for Responsive Politics says Wall Street's power is well documented.
Wall Street, the banks, and the financial industry writ large is the single largest source of campaign cash in the United States, and it has been for years, if not decades. It is kind of following the Willie Sutton rule of politics. You go where the money is. That's where the money is. They have not just political action committees that can pony up maximum amounts to influential members of Congress who have jurisdiction over their industry, but also they can pony up, pass the hat and pony up hundreds of thousands of dollars just among their partners and vice presidents and executives in their companies.
She says their clout will impact the election in 2012.
So they can muster a ton of money, and this is also seen specifically in the presidential race in 2012, where, of course, Mitt Romney has hailed from the private equity industry, and prior to that, Barack Obama had been the darling of Wall Street. So Wall Street and banks in particular are an enormously influential part of the U.S. industry.
That power is being shown as Wall Street lobbyists try to sabotage financial reforms passed by Congress.
2 years after the passage of the legislation, and are the regulators doing the good things that Congress told them to do? And the answer to a considerable extent is no. They're way behind on issuing the rules that they're supposed to issue. Where they actually have issued the rules, they're getting challenged in almost every instance in court by the Chamber of Commerce or the Financial Securities Roundtable or other Wall Street interests. And they're having a tough time with a judiciary that's favorable to big business and maintaining the rules that they've issued.
So reforms can be passed, but they can also be sabotaged.
Right. They get multiple bites at the apple. They get a bite in Congress, where they've got enormous power, but at least it's mostly a public fight. And then they go to the regulatory agencies, where they also have enormous power, but it's usually below the radar, off the front pages, and they don't even have the public scrutiny.
Recently, on a radio show I host, I discussed Wall Street power and the financial meltdown with financial journalists Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert, as well as Andy Stepanian, an animal rights activist who led a campaign against a company in the business of painful medical tests on puppies. After his group drove their stock price down, the company went broke, but then the government labeled him a financial terrorist and sent him to prison. We began by comparing Wall Street to the Titanic, the unsinkable ship that sank.
If the Titanic were the story today, the difference would be that Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan would have heavy bets that would pay off when the ship sinks, and Hank Paulson would be down there widening the gash.
It brings me to a new study out just recently, and they looked at hundreds of shipwrecks throughout the past few hundred years. And what they found is that the norm is actually for women and children to die more frequently than men, and that the captain usually didn't go down with the ship. They were usually their survival rate was the highest.
These guys, they use derivatives, as Warren Buffett calls them, weapons of mass financial destruction. to make situations worse, because their bets that they have on these calamities becoming worse pay off enormously, and we see that in the numbers, in the bonuses. It's reflected.
Andy, you were nodding before when Max was speaking about all of this. Is this really true that they're betting against, us in a sense, betting against, hoping for bad things to happen?
I don't think that everybody that works on Wall Street has this mentality, but there is a culture that's in place where people have learned to at least accept and justify behavior like looking at these investments, betting investments against, things to fail, whether it be a government, whether it be a country, or whether it be a company to fail, and say, oh, well, I can justify this. And you look at it like it's numbers. You don't look at the people behind it. You don't look at the families that suffer. You don't look at the country that suffers as a result.
Well, here's what is mind-boggling to me, is you are presenting a picture of intentionality, that people did things to further their own interests. They knew what they were doing. It was calculated. And yet, in most of the media, it seems as if it's presented as some sort of mistake, as miscalculation. Gee, we wanted housing to go up, but it went down. You can't blame us. Everybody was doing it, therefore nobody was doing it, therefore nobody can be prosecuted.
Well, let's assume that there was intention. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Some would argue that it's a good thing to have people who are parasites in an economy, because parasites are useful. I have parasites in my intestines. They perform a useful function. The problem is the parasites don't run my heart, lungs, and brain. In America, the parasites write the regulatory framework that's supposed to be governing them. So the parasites run the show.
Is Wall Street affecting, capital? Is Wall Street affecting our policy making? Well, they're becoming our policymakers, at least for a short period of time, and then returning back to the banks.
So it's a revolving door kind of thing.
Essentially. I mean, they're in and out of whether it be the Bush administration or the Obama administration, the different positions within the cabinet that are governing finance are individuals that are former CEOs of banks, or they might go back to being an honorary chair on the board of directors. It's this incestuous relationship between Wall Street and policymakers.
Sounds so corrupt.
Danny, you asked who runs America, and I say it's ignorance. And, Thomas Jefferson warned of this, and that we needed a media who would inform the population. Otherwise, we would lose our democracy. So this is ignorance that is being forced upon you, criminalizing knowledge.
This is something that I was startled by when NASDAQ opened up, in Times Square, a big studio out front with a big window, and then I said, I'd love to tour the exchange, and this was the time that Bernie Madoff was running NASDAQ, and they said, you can't tour the exchange. There is no exchange. It looks like an exchange. There's a building that says NASDAQ, but the actual operations are computers.
Algorithmic trading goes well beyond that. As you're alluding to, it's not about individuals who are taking any risks personally to make a market as part of a capitalist system. These are computers that have virtually unlimited credit, because the cost of credit is now zero, and the ability for a bank like JP Morgan with a $90 trillion balance sheet of derivatives, they can lend $1 trillion to a computer program to make a bet. If the bet doesn't work, then they get a federal bailout. If the bet works, then they get a bonus. So it's heads they win, tails we lose. And this has been going on now for a number of years, but it's gotten shockingly more disproportionate and asymmetric.
This shift towards super-fast computers is just another example of the deeper shift we've seen in power as finance, in effect, takes over, with politicians courting Wall Street at global conferences and in private meetings, as George Soros explains.
It is actually symptomatic of the age, because you have presidents and prime ministers courting the financiers and the industrialists. So it does show a shift in the relative power, but I don't want to convey. See, I don't believe that business can in any way replace the power of the state, because it's different kind of power. So the sovereignty is still in the hands of the state.
Wall Street, you know, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but Wall Street controls everything, you know. I mean, they're the major shareholders of all the major companies. Look at the BP oil spill. Who is the owner of BP oil spill? The biggest shareholder is JP Morgan. There's so much happening now, you know. There's no stopping what's happening now. The system, everyone knows the system's broken. Whether you're a 1%er or a 99%er, a Republican, a Democrat, anarchist, communist, capitalist, everyone knows the system is broken. So now we need to fix it.
We'll give the last word to a scholar with a longer view, American historian Eric Foner.
I think what we face is a serious democracy deficit, not only in the United States, but in many other countries as well. I'm not quite ready to say a plutocracy determines everything that happens in the United States, but I think the democracy deficit arises from the fact that fundamental issues are now just off limits from democracy. It doesn't matter who is elected. The basic issues about finance, about deindustrialization, things like that are about globalization, about the loss of power of ordinary people over their own lives. That's not open to discussion. I don't care if it's Democrat, Republican, Obama, Romney. That's not part of what their debate is. Their debate is at the margins so that the fundamental issues facing ordinary people are not subject to democratic consideration. Government does not represent the ordinary people. Even though people elect the government does not respond at all to the needs and aspirations of ordinary people.
In this series, we've investigated who rules America, examining the history of deep conflicts in this country going back to the American Revolution. We've dissected the power of the military, corporations, the media, and Wall Street. We have shown that these powerful forces often undermine democracy rather than strengthen it. There is a battle underway for the soul of America, for who rules America, that has put these deeper issues on the agenda. The question, is a fundamental transformation possible, or will special interests and the wealthiest Americans continue to dominate in a country that says it's the most dynamic democracy on earth?
The belief in our democracy is almost an article of religious faith, even though there's a separation of church and state. Perhaps that's why the views you've heard in this series are rejected by the establishment, rejected by academia, rejected by the press. They believe only the people have power if anyone does. But opinion leaders don't look into it. They don't focus on interests, they focus on ideologies, on personalities, not institutions. The idea of a power elite is an anathema to them, because if people believed it, that might spur dissatisfaction and dissent. In the age of the internet and global television, you can't stop people from being exposed to counter-narratives to official myths. These issues are debatable, of course, but most political coverage doesn't debate other ways of looking at the world. It relies on the usual pundits recycling conventional wisdom. They don't ask who rules America.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.